Welcome to the Book of Lamentations. Now, on August 7th of this year, 2022, synagogues around the world will gather to read the Book of Lamentations. It is a holy day in Judaism. It's called Tisha B'Av, which simply means the ninth day of the month of Av. Now, on that day in 586 or 587, the Babylonian army finally broke through the walls of Jerusalem and burned the city and its temple to the ground and carried its inhabitants off into exile. So Lamentations is a poem of mourning written by somebody who witnessed the siege and subsequent slaughter of that city. Lamentations then is a lament which for 5 long chapters gives full vent to the emotional bewilderment and unthinkable suffering of that darkest day in Jewish history, Tisha B'Av. You can read about it in 2 Kings 25, but I warn you, it is a much different experience to read about it in the Book of Lamentations. Let me show you what I mean. So take a look here at 2 Kings, where we read about the siege, which lasted for 2 years. It started in the 9th year of his reign and went until the 11th year. And look at verse 3. It says that the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. But look how Lamentations expresses this same idea. So here we are in Lamentations on the left. Let's go down to verse 11 of the first chapter. It says, that all her people groan as they search for bread, and they trade all their treasures for food in order to revive their strength. Look down at chapter 2. My eyes are spent with weeping, my stomach churns because of the destruction of the daughter of my people, and because babies and infants, they faint in the streets. They cry to their mothers, where is bread and wine? And they faint like a wounded man in the streets. The tongue of the nursing infant sticks to the roof of his mouth for thirst, and children beg for food, but no one gives it to them. Man, you can just feel the emotion and the pain and the heartache of the poet in the Book of Lamentations. But what's unique about this book is that all of this raw emotion is channeled into 5 just beautifully crafted literary masterpieces. These are called acrostics, which are basically alphabet poems. So there are 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and therefore you can see many of these chapters have 22 verses in them. And they contain, these 22 verses contain 22 stanzas. And if we look at the first couple of poems, chapters 1 and 2, you'll notice this design, which I've kind of scrawled in brown here. So these 22 verses, which contain 22 stanzas, each of which is 3 lines long. And the beginning, the first line of each stanza will have the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The same is true in chapter 2. And it's a similar pattern in chapter 4, but instead of a 3-line stanza, you have a 2-line stanza. And the first line of each new stanza for the 22 stanzas, for the 22 verses, is the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Chapter 3 is a little bit different. It has the 3-line stanzas again, just like chapters 1 and 2, but it has, but each line has the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet instead of each stanza. So that's kind of interesting. We'll see that in a minute. And then in chapter 5, it kind of falls apart a little bit, where we only have 1-line stanzas, and it doesn't follow the Hebrew alphabet at all. Let me kind of show you this in the text. It's helpful. So we don't need this anymore. Goodbye, 2 Kings. But what we do need is the Hebrew alphabet. There it is. All right. Scroll over. Boom. Hebrew alphabet for us. Now let's go back to chapter 1 of Lamentations. You'll see what I mean. So Lamentations chapter 1 has 22 verses in it, and each verse has 3 lines. So this is the first line, this is the second line, this is the third line. Same is true with the second stanza. Now let's look at it in the Hebrew. So this is a little bit overwhelming. One little tip for you, you read from the right to the left in Hebrew, and you'll notice how this is the first stanza, and look how the stanza starts. It starts with an aleph. That's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It goes aleph, then beit, gimel, dalet, hey, vav, zayin, hate. And then you'll see the same thing in chapter 2, aleph, beit, gimel, dalet, hey. And then if we go to chapter 4, it's the same pattern, but you'll notice that the stanzas are shorter. They only have 2-line stanzas instead of 3-line stanzas. But again, aleph, beit, gimel, dalet, hey, vav, zayin, hate, tate, yod, kaf. Prepare yourself for a change in chapter 3. Now look at this. Now, the lines are much shorter. The stanzas are 3-line stanzas, but each line of the stanza begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, 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 beit, 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 gimel, 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 dalet, 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 hey, hey, hey. Isn't that interesting? And then you go to chapter 5, and there's just 1-line stanzas, but they don't follow the alphabet at all. It's just this completely random order. Zayin, Nun, Yod, Mem, Ayin, Mem, aleph, ayin, beit, ayin, just all over the place, completely random. So what is the purpose of this just very intricate design of the several poems in the book of Lamentations? Well, what this book is probably doing is presenting the full, complete expression of the suffering and grief of the people of Israel. It is as if the poet drew from every letter of the alphabet in order to express the depth of his pain. It's Israel's suffering from A all the way to Z. But then finally, when he gets to chapter 5, he just can't hold it together anymore, and all of his grief just explodes back into chaos, and it doesn't follow any pattern anymore in chapter 5. So what's a book like Lamentations doing in our Bible? Well, I think it's important to recognize that not only was the suffering just unthinkable on that day, Tisha B'Av, but also that day signaled a massive shift in the nature of God's relationship with his covenant people. Tisha B'Av changed everything for them. I mean, think about all of their institutions on that day were destroyed. No king, no kingdom, no land anymore. No city of the king, no temple in that city, no priests, no sacrifices. Everything was gone. And the people of Israel must be asking, while in exile in Babylon, what does it mean for me to be a member of God's covenant people when all of the defining characteristics of the covenant people of God have been stripped away? Has God abandoned his promise to Abraham of the land, his promise to David of the king? How can we, as a people of God, trust in the goodness of God in light of the horrors of the exile? Well, these are the kind of questions which the Ketuvim, the third part of the Hebrew Bible, is designed to answer. Now, what do I mean by the Ketuvim? Let's remind ourselves of that quick. And look at this chart. So the Hebrew Bible, the Bible that Jesus read, the Old Testament was in a different order than in our English translations. It is in what's called the Tanakh order: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. So the Torah and the Nevi'im describe Israel's creation, the creation of the nation of Israel, and then Israel's road to exile. It tells the story of the road to exile twice, in the former prophets and in the latter prophets. And then the Ketuvim, the role of the writings, this third part of the Hebrew Bible, is to reflect back on and to wrestle with the disorientation of the exile. And we're going to listen in to Lamentations' contribution to that conversation next.